if you remember, we started first with a definition of phenomenology. Then we started discussing the concepts elucidated by Husserl, German philosopher. After discussing Husserl, we also discuss Heidegger, and we know that Husserl and Heidegger, they are two key figures, right? Husserl influenced number of other theorists, and Heidegger in his turn also influenced number of theorists. There is another important development in the history of phenomenology, and that is one particular method which goes by the name of hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is also very famous method which has been used to talk about certain scriptures and later works of literature. So we'll be talking about that also. Apart from hermeneutics, we also had a look, rather we just dropped a hint about another development, and that was reception theory. Again, this whole idea of reception theory comes from Germany. So we are talking about one philosophical school which has many currents, and all those currents have something to do with the philosophical traditions which were developed in Germany. Apart from reception theory, we also cover a little bit of ground which is relevant to reader response criticism that you have already studied in your undergraduate years. And finally, we discussed that how there is always a need to just nail just the meaning of a particular work. Is it being recorded? Okay. So let us first hear something from you. Let me just ask Abid first. Abid, if I have to. Yes, Abid. Can you say something? I just want you to speak. Yes. Afri, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Just speak a few words so that I know that you are following me.
Yes, sir.
Are you following me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So right now I'm going to unmute you all so that you have my voice coming clearly. Okay, unmute everyone. Okay. Now when I speak to you, and when I ask you to raise your hand, then just raise your hand. So how is my voice? How is the voice quality presently? Can you just raise your hand if it is good? Okay, okay. So now we can start the lecture now. So you see that we started our discussion of phenomenology. Now, how do we define phenomenology? Already we have talked about it. So essentially, we are talking about experience, and we are talking about structures of experience. This is the word, structures of experience. And phenomenology
इसमें डालू रखते
was
रखते में
developed in one particular
अरे
context.
तो सर्विस पे हुई तो डालनी पड़ेगी
Yes.
सर
Qayyum raised his hand.
सर आबिद
Yes, Qayyum. Okay.
Some of them are making noise. Please tell everybody to settle down.
Right. Actually, have to unmute all, unmute all. Is it better?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you see that we defined phenomenology, and essentially phenomenology is a study of the structures of experience. You know that we have our experience, we experience the world, we value our experience, we get some knowledge through our experience. So phenomenology is essentially a study of the structures of experience. Now this particular study had its origin at a very important moment in history. And what was that important moment? It was after the First World War. So everything appeared uncertain. So in that atmosphere of uncertainty, one German philosopher, his name was Husserl, he tried to find some certainty, right? And he wanted to find some certainty about knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, how possibly we know what we know. So in that respect, you can also say that he tried to look at things, look at objects, not as they exist in the outside world, but as they appear to our consciousness. That means if there are objects in the outside world, how they appear to our consciousness, how they appear to our consciousness, actually, that is important, not their independent existence in the world. So that means I'm in direct relationship through my consciousness to those objects. And if I acquire some knowledge, then that knowledge is reliable because that is directly experienced. So this much about this particular term. Now, objects can be regarded not as things in themselves, but as things which are intended by consciousness. But there are so many objects in the world. And if we are focusing attention on one object, then it is also important in phenomenology that we must suspend our natural attitude. We must suspend our opinions about all other things, but focus only on the thing, the object which we are looking at, which we are experiencing. In phenomenology, this is called phenomenological reduction. That means we are reducing things to one particular thing which we are trying to experience, which appears to our consciousness, right? We have already discussed this point, and we further say that phenomenology is also interested, and this is Husserl's phenomenology is also interested in discovering the essence of objects, essence of things, the essential nature of something. In other words, he is trying to get to the essence of something. And when one learns the essence of something, then one is also learning the universal nature of that particular thing. So if we learn something about a table, then we have also discovered the essential nature of table. If we look at a bird, then we also discover something about the essential nature of that bird. That means in phenomenology, essentialism is an important concept. And we are talking about universal essences of things. So it is not simply one object, it is not simply one particular thing, but rather its essence, its universal essence, which becomes important. Furthermore, we see that this particular criticism influenced, it had great influence on Geneva School of Criticism. Was a school of criticism called Geneva School of Criticism. What happens when we read something inspired by Geneva School of Criticism? There is one important work which is attempted in that background. And what is that work? It is the early work of American critic J. Hillis Miller. J. Hillis Miller is usually known as a critic of deconstruction, somebody who applies deconstruction to the study of literature. But in his early work, and this work is on Thomas Hardy, the title of that work is Distance and Desire in Thomas Hardy. What is he trying to do, or what a critic tries to do when a critic offers a phenomenological reading of an author? The critic does not look at the biography of the writer. That means, what are the biographical facts of a writer's life? They are considered unimportant. The critic does not even see the conditions of the production of that work. That means, when that particular work was produced, what was the context of its production? Even that thing is unimportant. Even the intention of the writer. Say, for example, a writer wanted to write something. Writer had a particular intention. Milton says that his intention in writing Paradise Lost was to justify the ways of God to man. But in this kind of criticism, even intention is unimportant. And of course, who is reading that work? Readership is also unimportant. But what is important? And there is a word, it is an imminent kind of reading. That means, when you read a particular writer, you read all his works, and you see that how his consciousness emerges in that work, how his consciousness emerges through all his works. And by entering the consciousness of that writer, which emerges through his corpus of writings, critic is discovering the consciousness behind that work. So, for example, if I am reading Somerset Maugham and I read one particular novel of Somerset Maugham, then I read other novels of Somerset Maugham, and I try to discover the consciousness which is at work in those works, and I enter that consciousness by reading those works, and I have a full grasp of that consciousness which is behind all those works of Somerset Maugham. So you see that a criticism which is inspired by Husserl. Husserl is interested in the consciousness. Husserl is interested in objects as they appear to our consciousness. And here the critic is interested in all those works of a writer, but how they appear to a critic's consciousness. Right? So this is criticism, which is phenomenological criticism, which is inspired by Husserl. But as we read further, we see that many developments take place in the history of this criticism. Husserl was a very important philosopher, but Husserl also had a very learned disciple, a very learned pupil. His name was Heidegger. Heidegger is also a very important name in the history of German philosophy. Heidegger rejected Husserl's ideas. Heidegger rejected Husserl's ideas. So for him, what was important? He said meaning is something which is historical. That means, whenever we are reading a particular work, or whenever we are looking at a particular thing or at a particular object, it is not by making sense of that work through our consciousness, but rather also looking at the historical dimension of our existence, which explains the meaning. And what else he says about this particular dimension, historical dimension, he says that we are part of a world, we are thrown in that world, we did not choose to be in this world, and because we did not choose to live in this world, but that world is very much part of our existence, and our existence is very much part of this world. So there is a certain givenness about our existence. There is one very important word which is used in his philosophy, and that word is the sign. The sign. That means the sign is being in the world, being, existence in the world. So for Heidegger, our existence in the world, being in the world, The sign is very important. What else we can say, that there are certain terms which are used to talk about Husserl's philosophy, and a term which is used to talk about Heidegger's philosophy. Heidegger's philosophy is hermeneutical phenomenology, and Husserl's philosophy is transcendental phenomenology. This is an interesting term, transcendental phenomenology. Why is it an important word in the context of Husserl's philosophy? Because in phenomenology, and especially phenomenology which is advanced by Husserl, and of course this term also, or this philosophy also, owes its origin to Husserl. Here subject is transcendental. Subject is so powerful. Subject is so important. And I explained to you the meaning of the word subject in philosophy. Subject is individual. So individual consciousness is so important that it can discover meaning of an object. It can discover universal meaning of an object. That means individual consciousness is so important. There were other schools, philosophical schools earlier. Say, for example, positivism, where outside world was very important. And in later theories, you will see that certain other things are important, not subject. So when we say that subject is important, that means human subject becomes very important. Individual becomes important. Individual consciousness becomes very important. Now, there is some criticism of Heidegger also. And what is that important criticism of Heidegger? That he advocates a kind of servility before a text. That means one should listen to the meaning of a text and the meaning will come automatically. That means he advances, or he advocates, a kind of servility before a work. And what more, even his so-called emphasis on history is also not very reliable, because he is not talking about history which we live, history which is there in the outside world, history of oppression, history of power, history of relationships, but rather he is talking about time and being. That is time. Time is a more abstract concept. History is a more specific concept. Time, something very abstract, but history is something specific. You have history of people, you have history of nations, you have history of exploitation, you have history of madness, you have history of revolts, you have history of protest. But time appears very abstract when we compare time to the concept that the word history carries with it. There is another more say serious criticism of Heidegger, that he had a brief stint flirtation with Marxism. So in a way, here this entire attitude of servility before a text is akin to servility before Führer, before Hitler. Now these are two important names, Husserl and Heidegger, and we see that their ideas, their philosophical ideas, are taken up by many critics who are talking about literature directly. Husserl and Heidegger are not talking about literature directly; they are philosophers. But Geneva School of Criticism was a school of literary criticism, so they were inspired by Husserl's ideas. Then there are others also. Two important names here. One is the name of an American hermeneutist, E.D. Hirsch. Who is he? An American hermeneutist. He is inspired by the ideas of Husserl. So we see this link. Husserl influencing American hermeneutist E.D. Hirsch. And there is one other name. His name is Hans Gadamer. Gadamer is also a philosopher and he is also a literary theorist. Gadamer is inspired by Heidegger. So we see the work of Husserl and Heidegger is creating a kind of chain where others will join in. So let us first think about E.G. Hirsch, and I use the word hermeneutics. Hermeneutics. That that E.G. Hirsch was an American hermeneutist, and the other person Heidegger also used hermeneutist, and the word hermeneutics was also used with reference to the philosophy of Heidegger. So what is hermeneutics? What is hermeneutics? If you look at the history of hermeneutics, it was first applied to the study of Bible. It was first applied to the study of scriptural text. That means religious text, works of religion. But after that, it was applied to secular literature as well. And hermeneutics is a method of study. It is a particular kind of approach to text. And what is important in all this discussion is meaning. That means what is the meaning of a work? How do we arrive at the meaning of a particular work? How meaning can be disputed? What are various methods to arrive at the meaning? And what is the certainty that our meaning is right? Whether the meaning is stable or not, or whether the meaning changes over a period of time. These are all questions which are relevant to any student of literature, important for any student of literature. So hermeneutics, let us define, is the study of understanding, how we understand something. The term also has a particular kind of origin. Term, that means I'm talking about the semantics of the word hermeneutics. It takes its name from Greek god Hermes. You know that many important terms in English literature, many important tropes in English literature, many important concepts in English literature, they owe their origin to Greek mythology. So here we are. Hermes is the name of Greek god. And what this Greek god used to do, he used to deliver and interpret messages. It is somebody who delivers a message and somebody who interprets a message. Here you have a clue to this method of study, hermeneutics. Somebody who interprets and somebody who delivers. This, as I said, was a method which was used to study biblical text. There is often a lot of discussion about the meaning of certain concepts in Bible, meaning of certain allusions in Bible. What is the meaning? And you know that even in Quranic interpretations also, there is no single interpretation about certain things. You have so many different interpretations of Quran. You have so many interpretations of certain hadith. That means interpretation is something which is basic to any study in the humanities. And of course, whether you study Quran or you study Bible, you are also studying a particular form of literature. Bible is also considered a form of literature. You don't read everything literally in Bible. Similarly, Quran is also a form of poetry, and you don't interpret everything literally. And you know that there are any number of interpretations, and critics often disagree with the work of each other. So hermeneutics was basically a method which was used to the study of Bible. And what is central to hermeneutics? Understanding, meaning, interpretation. These are the things. Now, today, for example, hermeneutics is not confined to Bible, but rather hermeneutics can be used, it can be employed, or this method can be employed to different kinds of texts. That text can be written, that text can be performed, That means written means we are talking about books that we read. It can be performed. So, for example, we are watching the performance of a play. That play is also a performance, or we are watching a film. That is also a performance. So, whether we are reading a book or we are watching a play in a theater or we are watching a film, these are examples of performed text. And you can also have a photographic text. So, you see a painting, you see a picture, you see, say, pieces of sculptures. These are all examples of certain images, but they are also examples of text. You see the picture of Mona Lisa, and still there is a lot of debate about the meaning of Mona Lisa's smile. You just Google Mona Lisa's smile, and you'll find that there are number of interpretations about her smile. And so you can also have number of interpretations of other pictures also. See, in postmodernism, for example, you have those pictures of Madonna, you have those pictures of many pop stars. They also convey a certain kind of meaning. So, hermeneutics can be applied to the study of written text, that means literary text. It can be applied to the study of performed text, plays, films, and so on. And it can be applied to the study of photographic text, something that you see in the form of pictures. There is another very interesting term about hermeneutics. And what is that term? Hermeneutical circle. Hermeneutical circle. Now, what is hermeneutical circle? There, the assumption is that a work is a kind of organic whole, and there are different parts of a work, and there are individual features. All these individual features together make a whole, and a whole consists of all those individual features. That means individual features make a whole, and whole consists of individual features. So what happens in employing the method of hermeneutics, that if we want to understand the whole, if we want to understand the entire context of a work, then that context is understood in relation to all possible parts, all possible individual features. Or if we want to understand one particular feature, one individual feature, that individual feature is to be understood in relation to the whole, in relation to the entire context of the work. Say, if we are reading a novel and we are looking at one particular character, then that character can be understood only in relation to all other things in that text. And similarly, if we want to have a fair idea about the context of a work, then that context is explained with reference to all individual features which comprise that work. So this is something about hermeneutics. Now, what else is there about hermeneutics? Hermeneutics has usually been applied to the study of past works which were written, say maybe in earlier periods. Usually, hermeneutics is not employed to study contemporary works. And furthermore, you see that hermeneutics also sees a kind of relationship between past and present. That means there is a kind of living dialogue between past and present. We see past through the vantage point of present, and we analyze present with reference to past. So this is a kind of living dialogue between past and present, right? Now this is very important because we are talking about one particular method of study. Now here something about its history also. You see that hermeneutics, or first important name in hermeneutics, was the name of one German writer. His name was Friedrich Schleiermacher. Friedrich Schleiermacher. He was interested in the intention of a writer. Intention. What is the intention of a writer? That means the initial impulse or initial emphasis of hermeneutics was the intention of a writer. And that intention was gathered by reading the work. Suppose we are reading an old work, we do not know why a writer wrote something, what was his intention. So we try to discover that intention through the work. This is interesting. Say, for example, today, if you read a work by a contemporary writer, say Mirza Wahid, for example, writes a work, or Tabish Khair writes a work, or Amitabh Ghosh writes a work, or Arundhati Roy writes a work, they often express their opinions about that work. Their interviews appear in newspapers. They talk about their intention also. And if they don't talk about their intention, then at least many reviewers and interviewers, they pester them with these questions. What was your intention? What was your purpose in writing this? That we know a lot about the intention of a writer as far as contemporary works are concerned. But intention can never be discovered so easily when we are talking about an old work. Leave alone intention. Sometimes even authorship cannot be established of older works. When Shakespeare wrote, say 50 years ago, certain plays were attributed to Shakespeare. But later, names of certain co-authors were added to the name of Shakespeare because it was thought that these authors also collaborated with Shakespeare on those works. So when it is so difficult to even attribute authorship to a work, intention becomes even more difficult to discover. So hermeneutics initially tried to discover the intention of a writer, and you know that intention is an important factor here. But later works or later critics or later writers who employed the method of hermeneutics, for them intention was not so important, but rather meaning was important. So we define hermeneutics, and now we can possibly look at the work of E.T. Hertz, who is an American hermeneutist, and we can look at the work of Gadamer, who is a German hermeneutist. I already discussed the work of E.T. Hertz. All those questions that he raised, they are relevant even now. What is the meaning of a work? How we arrive at the meaning of a work? Whether the meaning of a work changes or the meaning remains universal, whether the meaning is the same for all people or it differs. These are all basic questions. And E.D. Hertz tried to answer those questions. So, first of all, he gave the concept of probable meanings. He says that, okay, if we are reading a very old work, we can possibly not be sure about the meaning of that work, but we can be sure about its probable meaning. So if Shakespeare was writing Macbeth, and if Shakespeare and Lady Macbeth was saying that all the perfumes of Arabia cannot sweeten this little hand, Lady Macbeth was not thinking about coronavirus, was she? Right? But today, for example, if you are sharing pictures of Lady Macbeth or sharing pictures of the cover page of Macbeth, and you are writing this sentence, all the perfumes of Arabia cannot sweeten this little hand. So there is obviously something about these lines which you consider important. So here you have a very nice distinction between two concepts. with E.G. Hirsch advances. One is the concept of meaning, and the other is the concept of significance. That means the meaning of a work maybe remains the same or almost the same, or it changes very little, but significance, in fact, is something different. So maybe future readers in different periods will derive different kind of significance from a work. So the fact that I'm reading Lady Macbeth's speech and I talk about coronavirus, I see some kind of relationship between that speech and possibly our own problem. This is part of the significance of that work. This was not the intention. But the big question remains, can we be very sure about the intention? And the answer is no. So maybe we can talk about probable intention. Since only 1 minute is left and anytime it can go off, I must announce that we will have 10 minutes break. So we were talking about E.D. Hirsch. And who is E.D. Hirsch? An American hermeneutist. That means a critic who is talking about literature and using the methods of hermeneutics to approach works of literature to answer some basic questions like what is the meaning of a work, like what is the intention behind a particular work, like what is the genre of a particular work, and all related questions. He made a distinction between intention of a work and significance of a work that I explained to you in the last session. There are also other things about his work. He also wanted readers and critics to pay attention to the intrinsic genre of a work. When I say intrinsic genre of a work, means some basic idea about the genre. A work may be an epic, and as an epic, it will follow certain conventions. A work may be a poem, and as a poem, it will follow certain conventions. A work may be a play, and it will follow the conventions of a play. There can be a blurring of boundaries also in many cases. Say, before novel writing proper began, there were many works which can also qualify as novels. What is the status of Pilgrim's Progress, for example? So here, E.D. Hirsch is talking about the intrinsic genre of a work. That means try to see, discover, look at the intrinsic genre of a work. There are some other terms also which are relevant in our discussion of E.G. Hirsch. He tries to establish a kind of typology of meaning. He also tries to follow certain general conventions. General conventions. Say, literature or writing literature is a very conventional kind of activity. You write a poem and you follow certain conventions. You write an epic and you follow certain conventions. So in all this, his worry was that there should be some certainty about meaning, some stability about meaning. You see the link between Husserl's philosophy and E.D. Hirsch's approach. What was Husserl interested in? We cannot be sure about the meaning of all those objects which exist in the world, but we can be sure how those objects appear to our consciousness. We can know something about their universal nature, their essence. So something of that essence can also be seen in E.D. Hirsch's criticism. There is a work, there is some kind of essence of that work, some kind of probable meaning of that work, some intrinsic genre of that work. We cannot be 100% sure about the meaning, but we can be pretty sure about the probable meaning. So the link between the philosophy of Husserl and literary criticism of E.G. Hirsch. There you had the essence of objects as they appear to an individual's consciousness. And here we look at the meaning, and in this case, probable meaning of a particular work. Husserl was interested in some kind of stability in an atmosphere of uncertainty. He was interested in discovering some uncertainty in an atmosphere when everything was uncertain. And here, E.D. Hirsch is also interested in discovering some kind of certainty about the meaning of a work. So certainty is important for Husserl, and certainty is also important for E.D. Hirsch. He was especially very critical of the approach of a critic like Gadamer, Hans Gadamer, who we will discuss next. Because if we followed somebody like Gadamer, then a literary work will mean something today and something else maybe tomorrow, and maybe a few days later something entirely different. So Husserl was interested in certainty in the world, in discovering certainty, and here E.D. Hirsch is also interested in some kind of certainty about the probable meaning of a work. You can see that he appears very authoritative, E.D. Hirsch. You can see that he wants to dominate meaning, control meaning. Oh, this is the meaning. And you can ask this question, how can we be sure even about the probable meaning? That means if we are not sure about the real meaning, how can we be sure even about the probable meaning? And Husserl, E.D. Hirsch is saying that we are not talking about meaning which is very certain, but probable meaning. Next we have Gadamer, and obviously E.D. Hirsch had Gadamer in his mind when he was talking about the stable meaning or some kind of stability as far as meaning of a work is concerned. Gadamer, as I said earlier, is influenced by Heidegger. And you know that Heidegger talked about being in the world. World is important. The sign is important. Our existence in the world is important for Heidegger. And here for Gadamer, whose most famous work was Truth and Method. What is he saying? That the meaning of a work is not exhausted by the intention of the author. That means whatever be the intention of a writer, when he is writing something, meaning goes beyond that writer's intention. Suppose a writer wants to write a work which is about life of birds. That is his intention. But what happens when readers read that work in a different context? They say that it is not about birds, but rather it is about human beings' existence. It is allegorical. It is hardly about birds. So whatever be the original intention of a writer, a work is, or its meaning is not actually exhausted by the intention. So that means these are two different things. Intention of a writer, but the critic looking at intention but going beyond that intention. Then important thing here is that new meanings come up. New meanings arise in a new context. And here we are somewhat close to E.D. Hirsch's idea of significance. New meanings come in a different context. New meanings arise. But important thing is that all interpretation is historically relative. That means we are going back to Heidegger's idea where he's saying about, he's talking about our existence in the world. that we and our world, they are related. And here a particular work and the world in which it is read, that becomes important. So that means all interpretations of past literature, all interpretations of past literature arise from a dialogue between past and present. There is a work which is written in 18th century. We are reading that work in 21st century. We are reading that work from the vantage point of 21st century. We are raising some questions which are relevant to us. And in that respect, history, historical movement, and our movement, they somehow relate. There is a dialogue between past and present. So maybe it is an old work, maybe it is a work which was written in the 18th century, but when we are reading that work, we see that there is a dialogue between past and present. So past is understood through the vantage point of present, and present is seen, looked at through the perspective of the past. And there is this dialogue between past and present. This dialogue can also be seen in the interpretation of works which were written earlier. What we see here, we see a critic, Gadamer, who is taking his ideas, or who is inspired by the ideas of Heidegger. And Gadamer also had a certain view of tradition. Now the question arises, okay, we are looking at a particular work in 21st century, and we have certain notions about literature, and we begin that work with those notions. There is a word for that. We start reading a work with a kind of pre-understanding. If I am reading a work, are you following me? Just raise your hand. Just raise your hand. Okay. So we have a particular kind of pre-understanding. We have some prejudice. We have some ideas with which we begin reading a work. But Gadamer is not worried about those ideas. He's saying that even those ideas with which we begin reading a work, they are part of a tradition. They're part of a tradition. That means certain ideas were relevant in 18th century and certain other ideas were relevant in 19th century. And then there is a kind of carryover of those ideas in 20th and 21st. But because those ideas are part of tradition, so our interpretation of that work will not be spoiled by our prejudices, and prejudice or our prejudices become something positive, something positive. So to just sum up some of the ideas of Gadamer, for him a work establishes a dialogue between past and present. For him, our prejudices with which we start reading a work, these prejudices are positive things rather than negative things. For him, there is a kind of continuing running tradition. And here, some criticism is also there of this idea that for Gadamer, the tradition is that high tradition of German art. This is not a tradition which takes into account work or artifacts produced by lesser mortals, but rather it is a high classical German tradition. And Gadamer, you know that he was influenced by Heidegger. And here we see that after Gadamer, there is another very important line in German criticism. And you know that this entire school is very heavily biased in favor of ideas which come from Germany. And what is the other current? What is the other trend? What is the other dimension of this whole approach? That is called German reception theory. German reception theory. One important practitioner of German reception theory also joked about this, that please do not think that we are talking about hotel management when we are talking about German reception theory. No, we are not talking about hotel management. We are talking about reception of works of literature. And you know that this is there in your notes also, which I have posted on your WhatsApp page. German reception theory is influenced by Gadamer, but what one important difference is there. You see, in classical hermeneutics, I'm sorry, past works were important, old works were important, and many critics who are inspired by, influenced by hermeneutics, for them also old works, classical works, works of an earlier period, they were important. But for German reception theory, even current works are important. That means the study of reception of the works is not necessarily the study of works which were written in distant past, but rather they can be works written in the same century. So reception theory also shares a common ground with reader response criticism. We have come across reader response criticism. So let us just talk about some differences. Reader response criticism is an umbrella term where you have critics talking about the role of a reader, but critics are coming from different theoretical approaches. Somebody may be a feminist critic, but because that feminist critic puts a female reader at the center of her enterprise, and so her work also qualifies as an example of reader response criticism. Somebody may be a structuralist critic, but because he's talking about a reader, so there also you can say that his work can qualify as reader response criticism. Similarly, there are critics who come from psychology background or from the background of deconstruction. So that way, reader response criticism draws its practitioners from different theoretical approaches, and so reader response criticism becomes a kind of umbrella term. German reception theory is also an umbrella term, but German reception theory is more cohesive in nature. And here you have mostly critics who come from one particular university in Germany. And what is that university in Germany? That is University of Constance. University of Constance. And that's why it is also called, say, Constance School of Criticism. They were writing mostly in 1960s. So we see the difference. Whereas reader response criticism is an umbrella term which draws its practitioners, its critics from different schools. German reception theory is more cohesive, based on the works of critics who were writing in 60s, and most of these critics were working in the University of Constance. Now, one very important name here, and this is the name of Robert Hans Joss. Robert Hans Joss. He's an important name in German reception theory. Joss is identified with one particular concept. That concept is horizon of expectations. And he also borrows one idea from a scientist, T.S. Kuhn, his concept of paradigm. So you see that Kuhn's idea of paradigm, Kuhn, Kuhn, this is the name of the scientist, Kuhn. His idea of paradigm is used, is employed, is adapted by Joss to talk about his concept of horizon of expectations. Now, what is this idea of paradigm? And Joss also explains this idea of paradigm. In different periods in the history of science, there are different frameworks of knowledge. There are different ways to create knowledge. There are different assumptions with which we create knowledge. So, if maybe in the 18th century there was a particular kind of paradigm in which all knowledge was created, it is not necessary that in 20th century the same paradigm will be used, the same framework will be used. Rather, a different framework is used to understand things, to create knowledge. One major example is that we had a particular conception of our universe earlier, a particular conception of our world. The world is flat. Maybe if one goes too far in one's voyage, one may fall from a particular point in water. This was an idea, this was an assumption, but later this gave way to a different nature of the world. So you have a Copernican system, but you also had Galileo. You had many such important names where they talked about the nature of our world. And similarly, if you look at the history of medicine, there was a time when those four humors were considered important. Four humors which represented four different kinds of temperaments of people. We no longer talk about those four humors. So it means that in different periods in history, there are different paradigms, and these paradigms help us arrive at knowledge in different ways. And the paradigm of a particular age is not necessarily followed by another age. So 19th century offered a different paradigm, and 20th may be different. And 21st century will discover its own paradigm. Now, this idea is related to Joss's idea of horizon of expectations. That means a work also appears in a particular horizon of expectations. A work also appears in the context of a storehouse of ideas. The work also appears in a climate of certain ideas. And then there is also a particular kind of climate in which readers operate. So work has a certain horizon of expectations, and readers also have a particular horizon of expectations. Readers in 20th century, early 20th century had a different horizon of expectations, and reader maybe in 21st century have different horizon of expectations. Let us see some examples which he mentions. He said that there was a time early on in the history of criticism, and this is what Joss is mentioning, where we followed a kind of classical humanist model of scholarship. Classical humanist model of scholarship, where human concerns, human values, human aspects of a work were considered very important. That if there is a work, what is the human significance of that work? Now, gradually, that human significance of the work or classical humanist model, classical humanist paradigm, classical humanist horizon of expectations gave way to another paradigm in which works were understood. And what was that paradigm? Where historicist and positivist paradigm. That means earlier, if somebody just read a work, one was not interested in the history of that work. One was interested in deriving some kind of human lessons from the work. But later, not human lessons, but rather a study of the sources of that work, a study of the context in which that work was produced. And you have a very good amount of scholarship, a very, say, number of books written on this particular subject, how sources of a work can be traced. So take the example of Shakespeare. One can say that, okay, Lady Macbeth is a very interesting study of jealousy, and Macbeth is a very interesting study of ambition, and ambition is all that is there about Hamlet. Oh, sorry, and ambition is all which is there about Macbeth, or say Hamlet is a person who thinks too much. That means we are talking about the human significance. But this method of scholarship gave way to another method of scholarship, and what was this? Historicist and positivist. And in this context, we see that, okay, Hamlet was written. When was Hamlet written? Okay, it was written in this particular age. How do you know that this was written at this particular time? And then we start looking at some of the sources. We think, oh, Shakespeare also had a son. His name was this, and probably Hamlet is a portrait of this particular person. And then we look at some other historical references. We try to work out those historical references. That means our entire focus is on discovering sources of that work. And what is that paradigm? Historicist positivist paradigm. But gradually, even historicist positivist paradigm gave way to a new paradigm, to a different horizon of expectations. If you look at the criticism produced by new critics or many other critics in 20th century, mid 20th century, then they became interested in the form of the work. Russian formalism, form of the work. New criticism, form of the work. Music of the words. Images which are used in the work. Metaphors which are used in the work. A sense of unity which one can discover after reading those images. The form of the work. That means that formal aspect, that aesthetic aspect. Okay, this is the aesthetics of this work. This gives us this kind of pleasure. This pleases us. When we discuss somebody like James Joyce, and James Joyce talks about his aesthetic theory, that is the aesthetic dimension. And when we look at a particular work, we see that this is the form of the work. And here we are not interested in the historical question. We are not interested in sources. We are not interested in the human significance. We are interested in the devices which are used in a work, that is there in Russian formalism. What are the devices which make art art? Russian formalism. What are the devices which are used by a poet to impart a sense of unity to a poem? New criticism. Study of cadence, study of metaphor, study of rhythm, study of imagery, study of figures of speech, study of rhetorical devices. All these are formal questions. Study of structure of a work, study of syntax, study of plot, study of the relationship between plot and story. These are all formal questions. So aesthetic and formalist paradigm was another paradigm. And you see that now we are studying a very different paper. So with the coming of new theories from 1960s onwards, new paradigms emerged. So he borrows a concept from one scientist, T.S. Kuhn, his concept of paradigm, and he adapts that concept to his concept, which is known as horizon of expectations. A work appears in a particular horizon of expectations, and it is also read in a particular horizon of expectations. And we saw that how even a very short history of criticism in 20th century can show us different horizons of expectations. And that means the meaning of a work is not fixed. Gadamer talking about past and present. A work is a dialogue between past and present. And Joss, who is influenced by Gadamer, is also talking about this fact that the meaning of a work is not fixed. It is not like a monument. Say, for example, you see a monument, you see Mount Everest, and Mount Everest possibly appears in the same shape to people in 1950 and maybe people in the 21st century. A work offers different faces to readers in different times, and hence the meaning of a work is not fixed. I hope you are getting this. Okay, so here we are now. After discussing Robert Hens Joss, we can also talk about the work of some other critics who took up this line, but they offered new insights. And I'll mention one very important name. He also comes from this University of Constance. He also belongs to Constance School of Reception Aesthetics, Reception Theory. His name is Wolfgang Isser. If you remember, I also gave you an article by Isser. It is from his book. The article is titled, he is talking about a work and he's talking about phenomenological approach to reading. If you can read just 3-4 pages of that article closely and maybe just browse the remaining pages, you'll have a fair idea about what Isser is up to. So Isser is an important name, but I don't think I should talk about Isser in this session. It has become too intense. Maybe we'll require another session with you, and there we'll just complete our discussion of phenomenology. I already met you in the classroom in the Faculty of Arts, discussed many of these things, but of course today we discussed something new. We discussed Gadamer, we discussed German reception theory, and we also tried to revise our ideas of some earlier theories like Husserl and Heidegger. So I'm going to unmute you now so that you can make your comments, right? And first of all, tell me whether this experience was good or bad. I'm sure that this experience was not bad. It was wonderful seeing you, but there are many other names I see on the screen: Seher Salim, Isha Gotwal, or Afrin Khan, Huda Khan. Actually, it looks good if we see each other. That gives us a very real kind of experience. So, for example, if I see Abdul Qayyum, I can also read his face expressions, and I can see that Ihsanul Haq is very, very, say, serious about this particular class. He's also smiling. I mean, I know that there are those facial expressions. And when I talked about Lady Macbeth and how Abid smiled, those are, they make this class a real class, right? So I'm going to unmute you for a while. Yeah. There will be some noise, I'm sure, but still for 2-3 minutes we can bear this noise here. Yes, Ehsan, would you like to say something?
Yes, sir. This is pretty much same as that of structuralism, where we cannot understand meaning in independence. When all these things are put together, then meaning is generated.
Yes, and we'll discuss structuralism in great detail. So actually, this is there may be some common ground between different approaches, but structuralism is a lot different. In structuralism, human subject is not important at all. Subject is liquidated, say just thrown away, and here human subject is important. So we'll come back to this particular point. Yes, yes, Abid, what do you say? Okay, Madiha would like to say something. Madiha or Isra, Ayun?
Hello.
Yeah. You're saying something, Madiha? Ayun? Anything? He's not there. Ayun. Abid? Yes.
No, sir, I don't have anything to say.
Yes, something. Not necessarily about the class, anything.
The class was very good.
Sir, will post queries over the group?
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. I've done the recording.
Well, today's your voice was much clearer. We had many classes on Zoom, but today your voice was much clearer.
Okay, you had another class also, something? Somebody?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We had with Sadaf ma'am, but today your voice is much clearer than her.
Okay.
Sir, is there any final meaning? How we can reach to the final meaning if meaning is probable?
It's a good question. So I'm going to unmute you for 1 minute, and then after it will go off. This is an interesting question. So just to answer this question, I have to unmute you. I'm going to mute you. I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. Yes.
This is a very interesting question. Is there any final meaning? Can we have one final opinion, one definitive opinion, one authoritative opinion, one opinion which is unmistakable about the meaning of a work? Well, it is an interesting question. But the answer is no. And why is the answer no? And here quickly I must make 2 points. One is that in different ways there have been different nails. So for example, one particular school comes with one nail. Okay, I am fixing this nail and this is the meaning. So phenomenology was maybe just one nail. And then came structuralism. Structuralism said that, oh, this is how we arrive at the meaning. Another nail. And then, of course, you see that later feminism came up with something, or post-structuralism came up with something. They said that this is another nail. So as far as meaning of a work is concerned, there is always a possibility of different interpretations, and you have different nails.